on the far metaphorical side of the spectrum. That's how they read the book of Genesis. But another mistake in reading the book of Genesis, which is what I was getting at yesterday, is to read it as merely a myth, to read it as something that was simply made up. The attempt of many modern biblical scholars is to tear apart God's holy word and leave it without any substance, without any authority. And that's why I spoke yesterday about one of the most common attempts is the book of Genesis. And people say, well, Moses didn't write it. In fact, there were at least 4 different writers. And whenever you see some apparent contradictions, that's because somebody else was writing there and edited it. And you begin to pull the book of Genesis apart. And you might say things like Genesis 1 and 2 are directly contradictory to one another. They are 2 different and contradictory accounts of creation. And as I said yesterday, I think that's a mistake to do that. I don't think it's necessary. And also, there is simply no evidence for that. Never in the history of the world of archaeology, maybe things might change, but there has never been multiple sources of Genesis that have ever been discovered. This is a mere hypothesis, a mere theory without any evidence. It's not as if we have ancient manuscripts of the book of Genesis in which some chapters are missing and other chapters are included. Everything we know of has the entire story of the book of Genesis. And the entire tradition of Jewish rabbis and church fathers and theologians, there is no evidence of this documentary hypothesis of many authors. Now, it is a commonplace in tradition for people to say that even though Moses wrote the book of Genesis, as the centuries went on, parts of it were edited. Right? For example, in the book of Deuteronomy, it talks about the death of Moses. Right? Presumably Moses didn't write that part. Right? That was an addition that came in later. But why is it significant that we maintain that Moses is the author? I think it does make a difference for how we read the book of Genesis. Then we see that Genesis is not a historical or scientific textbook. Moses himself was not a professional scientist or historian, so we shouldn't look for those things. And yet it also isn't a myth that was just made up. Rather, it was Moses before the people of Israel, telling them the story about the world, what they need to know about the world they were a part of, and what they needed to know about who they are and where they come from. If we understand that perspective, it helps us to read the book of Genesis the right way, as a theological history, teaching us about God, the world, and who we are. We have that mindset, then Genesis begins to come alive and full of all sorts of richness, things that especially the church fathers spoke of. Why did Moses articulate these particular parts of the story? What meaning did they have? For example, we see in the book of Genesis today, it says, "The Lord God formed man out of the ground, and he brought to the man all wild animals and various birds. And whatever the man called each of them, that would be its name. And the man gave names to all the cattle, all the birds of the air, all the wild animals, but none proved to be a suitable partner for the man." In the story, we see that man and woman are not created with different dignity. The woman was taken literally out of the side of man, showing their equality, their partnership in the world. And yet they're not the same. There's a great complementarity between man and woman from the beginning. In fact, man is incomplete without the woman. In this life, men are not complete without the presence of women, and vice versa. Man was made for woman, and women were made for men. Great complementarity. Also about this idea of Adam cataloging all of the animals. I remember when I used to read this, I used to read it as, something kind of arbitrary. God brings the animals to them, and Adam has this great privilege of naming the animals, right? Out of his own free will and desire. St. Irenaeus and other church fathers, They say that it wasn't that Adam was arbitrarily naming the animals, but rather God was progressively revealing to Adam the ways of the world, how things are. And so when those animals came before Adam, Adam was naming them, not arbitrarily, but rather seeing who they are, seeing their purpose, seeing why God created them, and therefore he gave them their name. Irenaeus uses the word catalog, which in Greek is katalogos, which means according to the mind or according to reason. Adam, in a certain way, was the first philosopher or the first scientist who looks out into the world and it dives deep into its mysteries and its order. And as the culmination of creation, he names those great pieces of God's creation. And there's so much more that could be said about this. But you guys have heard me say this before. I think this is one of the central doctrines that needs to be reclaimed in our modern age. In our modern age, there is such a desire of humanity to define for ourselves the way reality is. Instead of accepting God's creation and its mysteries and its orders, we want to impose ourselves on creation, defining good and evil, defining what it means to be a human, defining our own religion, our own preferences, our own morality. And yet the book of Genesis here, Moses is teaching the people this great gift of this ordered and mysterious and marvelous creation. And we, like Adam, are not supposed to define for ourselves, but rather dive deep into the mystery that is the world and is our human nature. And with our own voice and our own mind, to participate in that great potential, that great power that humanity has, to reveal to the world its own hidden nature and mystery. St. Albert the Great, St. Thomas Aquinas are great examples of this. They were Dominican priests back in the 1200s. And something that is not very well known about them, they were great theologians, they were great philosophers, but they were also some of the leading scientists of their day. St. Albert the Great in particular, he's the patron saint of scientists. Not only did he love reading the scriptures, reading theology, reading philosophy, but also experimenting on creation. Because, why? Because he looked out in the world and was full of absolute marvel and wonder, and wanted to dive deep into this great gift that God had given to him. We need to have some of that same spirit. We need to have more marvel and wonder at the world we are a part of.